I'd like to take a look at the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, the story of the Exodus that we retell and relive each year at Pesach, and to think about it in the context of the fact that not only was it the beginning historically of the Jewish nation, but in many ways defines us and continues to define us. So if we start with the Mishnah in Maseches Pesachim, the Mishnah provides the format for how we tell a story. Maschil begunus u'masayim b'shevach, that we begin with the derogatory part of the story, of the gunus, u'masayim b'shevach, and we must conclude with the praise or the positive aspect of the story of Mitzrayim. V'doresh, and we expound upon the part of the Torah, me'arami oved avi, from the words Arami oved avi, which is found in Sefer Devarim, Ad sheyigmor kol haparsha kula, until we complete the entire section of the Torah of Arami oved avi. And these two statements of Maschil b'gudos Masayim v'shevach, and the statement that we learn and interpret the psukim of Arami oved avi, are both critical, and I'd like to look at both of them. But we'll begin with Maschil b'gunos Masayim v'shevach. The Gemara asks, "My beginus, what is the derogatory part of the story that, in fact, we begin with when we tell the story of Mitzrayim?" And here we have the machlokas. Rav Amar, Rav says, "Mitchila ovdei avodas gululim hayu avoseinu." We begin with the fact that our ancestors were idolatrous. Ushmuel Amar avodim hayinu. And Shmuel says we start with the words Avadim Hayinu, the fact that we were slaves in Mitzrayim. And this debate, what's startling to me about this debate is that there's no conversation in the Gemara about this machlokas. Usually when the Gemara presents two opinions, they'll analyze them, have a conversation, raise problems or with one or proofs to another. Here the Gemara ends with this. That's it. It states the two opinions, and in fact, we paskin like both. The Rif says, "Ha'idna avdinan kitarvayu." Nowadays, we follow both of them, and we do both Rav and Shmuel. We begin with both paragraphs of Mitchila Ovdei Avodas Kachavim, as well as Avadim Hayinu. The Rambam says the same. The Rambam says, how do we start with this? With the Gunus and Masayim Shevach, we tell Matchil Mesaper Betchila Hayu Avoseinu Bimei Terech Ubimafanav Kofrim V'Toim Achar Hevel V'Rodim Achar Avodah Zarah. Our ancestors worshipped idols, and the Rambam adds to the Gemara by telling us which ancestors exactly did Avodah Zarah, and it refers to, remarkably, Terach, Avram's father, and before him. We're not referring to any Jews from the time of Avram and on, but only pre-Avraham, these ancestors did Avodah Zarah, and now, since Avram has come, we have recognized God and worshipped God. Messiah medachs ha'emes shekirvanu ha'makom lo v'ivdilanu min ha'toim v'karvanu liyichudo. So first of all, I want to look at this again later, the fact that we specify Terach as our ancestor that we're recounting, and presumably our history of idolatry essentially ended with Avram Avinu, and it's that we celebrate on Pesach. V'chein maschil modia she'avadim hayinu leparo b'Mitzrayim, and we also start with Avadim Hayinu and end with the freedom from Mitzrayim. And we know that in our Haggadah we do in fact do both. We actually changed the order. The Rambam puts Mitchila Ovdei Avodah Zarah first, probably because it was historically first, but in our Haggadah we do Avadim Hayinu first. After Avadim Hayinu, we tell a couple of short paragraphs about the mitzvah of Zechir Yetzias Mitzrayim, and then we do the Mitchila Ovdei Avodah Zarah Hayu Avoseinu V'Achshav Kirvana Ha'makom Avodaso. The thing that's startling to me is that when you have these two opinions, Rav and Shmuel, whether it's Mitchila Ovdei Avodah Zarah or Avadim Hayinu, it seems so obvious that Avodim Hayinu is so much more obvious and compelling. It seems so obvious that Shmuel is correct, that we should start with Avodim Hayinu as we tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, of the Exodus from Egypt. What was Rav even thinking that we should celebrate tonight and recount the story of how Avraham found God despite the fact that all of his ancestors were pagans? Why would that be the format of the story of Mitzrayim? And why wouldn't the Gemara even raise a question? You'd expect the Gemara to ask, Bishlam, according to Shmuel, Avodim Hayinu. That's what the Torah says. But Rav, where did he get the fact that Mitchila Odei Avodas Gilulim should be the format of telling the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim? It's unrelated completely. Moreover, we paskin like both. You would think that if there's an opinion in the Gemara that no one really understood, why would that become incorporated into the halacha and into our minhag? And we don't raise any questions with Rav, and we follow both Rav and Shmuel. And if you look in the Torah tells us the mitzvah to tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim multiple times. In each case, predominantly, the focus is on an Avodim Hayinu perspective. The Torah says when your children ask you, and these sources in the Torah for the mitzvah of telling the story of Mitzrayim are all formatted or framed as a story that someone tells their child. And V'yamarta levanecha, you should tell your children, Avodim Hayinu l'par b'Mitzrayim. This is straight out of the pasuk. Vayotziinu Hashem b'Mitzrayim ad chazakah. What's the story we tell our children? Avodim Hayinu. Or in this case, Asher Pasach al Batei b'nei Yisrael b'Mitzrayim v'nagfos Mitzrayim, that He saved us and didn't destroy us during Malchus Bechoros. B'chozik yad hotziyanu Hashem b'Mitzrayim b'beis avadim. V'avor zeh asa Hashem li b'tzeisim b'Mitzrayim. In each case, when the Torah describes the mitzvah to tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, it's always about the slavery and the freedom, or at least predominantly. Moreover, Avraham was promised this entire story. You should know that you will be a stranger. This is what's going to happen. God tells Avraham at the Bris Bein HaBesarim. You will be slaves. Your descendants will be slaves. You will be slaves. You will serve another nation, and then God will exact justice on those who persecuted us, and will redeem us. That is the story of Mitzrayim. Why are we focusing on the idolatry of Terach? Moreover, if we return to where we started from, the Mishnah links this concept of Maskil B'Gnus U'Mesayim B'Shevach to Arami Oved Avi. And to be honest, in the Mishnah, it's not clear whether these are two separate objectives. First of all, that it's Maskil B'Gnus U'Mesayim B'Shevach, and second of all, we should learn the parsha of Arami Oved Avi. Or if the Mishnah means to say that the way in which we do Maskil B'Gnus U'Mesayim B'Shevach is fulfilled or is illustrated in the Aramid Ovid Avi that we study at the night of the Seder. But if you look at the Rambam does link them. Tzarich L'Haskil B'Gnos M'Sayim B'Shevach describes Maskil B'Gnos M'Sayim B'Shevach, Avodah Zarah, Avodim Hayinu, V'hu, and that is Yidrosh Me'Aramid Ovid Avi Ad Sheyigmar Kol HaParsha, to interpret the parsha of Aramid Ovid Avi, which is to me the more obvious and natural interpretation, that Aramid Ovid Avi, which is the format of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, is itself the structure of Matzchil B'Gnos M'Sayim B'Shevach, and the other paragraphs are really embellishments on the story as told in the Aramid Ovid Avi. But here too, when you look at the Aramid Ovid Avi section, which is a parsha in the Torah in Sefer Devarim, which begins with, just to give you the context, it is in the context of the mitzvah of Bikurim. And the Torah describes how you come to Eretz Yisrael and you have you grow and produce the fruits of the land of Israel, the Shivas Aminim. We take each year the first fruits and bring it to the Kohen, and when we bring it to the Kohen, we make a declaration, and the declaration begins with the words Aramed Ovid Avi, and that's what the Mishnah refers to. Arami Ovid Avi Vayered Mitzrayim. Our forefather went down to Mitzrayim. Vayagar Sham b'Mesei Ma'at. Vayisham the Gadol Tzum V'Rav. He became a great nation. Vayareyu Osanu Mitzrim Vayanunu Vayitnu Aleinu Avodah Kasha. The Mitzrim, the Egyptians, persecuted us and enslaved us. Vanitzaka Hashem Elokei Avoseinu Vayishma Hashem et Koleinu Vayaret Anyenu As Amaleinu As Lachatzenu. God saw our suffering, our hardship, the hard work. Vayotzienu Hashem Mitzrayim B'Yad Chazakav V'Zroenu Tuyah Uv'Morah Gadol Uv'Ososum Ovsim. And God redeemed us from Mitzrayim, outstretched hands miraculously took us from the bondage of slavery and freed us. This text, this what we call the Arameid Ovid Avi, is the main text of the story of Mitzrayim. It is the main, it's the majority of the Magid is reading these psukim and reading the midrashim that explain them. What's fascinating, first of all, again we see that the focus is not, there's no mention of the idolatry of Terach in these psukim, or any idolatry. Why? So if Aramid Avid Avi is the fulfillment and the demonstration of Matzchel B'Gnosim Messiah V'Shevach, isn't it clearly supporting Shmuel that is Avodim Hayinu, that the story of Mitzrayim is the slavery and the freedom from that slavery? What's also interesting about the Aramid Avid Avi is that the Mishnah's language is V'hu Sheyidrosh Kol HaParsha Kula. We interpret the entire parsha, and a parsha in the Torah begins and ends where there's a space in the text of the Torah scroll, and here we don't actually go to the end of the parsha because the parsha continues for 3 more psukim and continues to say Vayavienu El HaMakom Hazeh Vayitin Lanu Ha'aretz Hazos Eretz Avas Chalav U'Dvash. That God now, after He redeemed us and freed us, brought us to this great land, flowing with milk and honey. That God now gave me, this is the first fruit that I'm bringing to you, to celebrate all the goodness. And here the Samach, which is printed in the Chumashim, indicates the end of the Parsha, the actual Parsha. So another question is, why do we leave out the end of the Aramid Ovid Avi? Why don't we actually complete the Parsha? Now you might say because it's not really relevant because it's focusing back to the context of Bikurim and not as much on the story of Mitzrayim. But why does the Mishnah say we should follow the entire story? So our question so far is really, why is it that the Gemara accepts these 2 alternative interpretations of Matzchel B'Gnos Messiah B'Shevach? What's the basis for conceiving of the possibility that Rav is correct, that it refers to the Avodah Zarah of Terach? Why do we follow Rav if it's so difficult to understand? Why is Rav so unsupported by all the psukim in the Torah that relate to the story of Mitzrayim, as well as the text of the Aramid Ovid Avi, which is the basic text of the story of Mitzrayim that we read at the Seder? And one final question is that the story of Mitzrayim is so fundamental to Judaism. Here I have the Mishnah, the Rambam, who formulates this as a mitzvah, one of the Taryag mitzvos, but it's a very fundamental mitzvah in the Torah to remember and retell the story of Mitzrayim. So I think it really behooves us to understand what is the significance of the story and what aspect of it are we trying to eternalize and come back to and review and review and review. What is the message of the story, and why is it so fundamental to our belief and our faith and our practice of Judaism? And you might have seen recently an interview with Jon Stewart and Jason Bateman, where Jason Bateman is describing an experience he had at a Seder, and they're trying to determine what exactly the which event, which Jewish event it was. He wasn't sure, and he was asked, did it involve the fact that the Jewish people were suffering and were almost destroyed and were saved? And he said, no, it was celebratory. And then John Stewart said, oh, that it wasn't a Jewish holiday. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that Judaism focuses a lot on the suffering of our people, the persecution that we've endured throughout our history, and we don't often identify ourselves as a nation who's celebrating something that's more positive. And in many ways, this is because of things like Yetzias Mitzrayim, where we're focusing on the Avadim Hayinu, on the slavery and the persecution that we've endured. And throughout history, the story of Mitzrayim has been identified with other sufferings that we've experienced as a nation. And there's countless stories of during the Holocaust of Jews who made tremendous sacrifices in order to celebrate their Pesach Seder during concentration camps and during suffering. And there's a very strong link and identification of the suffering that we experience now and being an illustration or a modern day example of the suffering of Mitzrayim. And suffering in general has become, therefore, a very big part of our national consciousness. This is just a copy of a painting of shtetl life, and whenever I once showed this to my grandmother, and she noted how no one's happy in the story, and that entire generation, life was so difficult, and there was this sort of sadness, which I think linked in to the sadness of the slavery in Mitzrayim, which we identified with because of the Seder. And we see that there are illustrations of this in the Haggadah itself, because there are texts that were added to the Haggadah throughout history which refer to this theme. For example, the Halach Manya was added, and in the Halach Manya, Hashata Hacha L'Shon Haba Ba'aretz Yisrael. Now we are here. Next year we should be in Eretz Yisrael. Hashata Avdei L'Shon Haba B'nei Chorin. This year we're slaves, and next year we should be free. And here's a very, very, very striking language, that the entire story of Mitzrayim is about how we used to be slaves and now we're free. And here we're saying that now we're slaves. We're not redeemed. We're not free from Egypt. And that's because we're in the exile now, and we aspire to return to Eretz Yisrael. And we're in our exile, we are identified as being together with the Jews who were slaves in Egypt. We have the Hisha Amda, Shelo echad bilvad aman aleinu l'chalosenu, that not one person tried to destroy us. It's not just about Paro. El shebechol dor vador omdim aleinu l'chalosenu. In every generation, they are standing up to wipe us out. V'akadosh baruch hu matzilenu mi'adam, and God saves us. And this is, I found this in the Siddur of Amram. It's obviously was added a long time ago, but makes the story contemporary. The Vihisha Amda relates the tragedy of Mitzrayim to what happens to the Jewish people throughout history. And similarly, Shfocha Mascha Al Goyim Asher Lo Yoda'ucha, this one was added during the Crusades, that God should throw out his anger at all the nations who are trying to destroy us today, and relate our suffering today to the suffering of Mitzrayim, the persecution and the hopes for survival. Also, we have on the Seder plate, we have Shnei Tavshil and 2 cooked foods, which are supposed to remind us of the Korbanos. And what our practice is to use basar v'beitza, the shank bone, and an egg. And the egg itself is to remember the Korbanos, but really in kind of a negative way. Like the Mishnah Berurah says that the egg reminds us that we're looking for redemption today, or it's like the egg of mourning for the Beis HaMikdash. So again, we have this like negative association when we're supposed to be celebrating something positive, the fact that we're now also in mourning over not having the Beis Hamikdash and linking our suffering to that. Moreover, this story of the Jewish persecution and survival and suffering is not just for the night of the Seder, but is really for every night of the year. We read this in the Haggadah that there's a mitzvah l'man tizkor es yom tzescha me'eretz Mitzrayim kol yomei chayecha. That there's a mitzvah to remember Mitzrayim every single day, which we mention includes not only the days, but also the nights. And we fulfill this each night and day by reading the Shema and describing Asher tzeisiaschem me'eretz Mitzrayim lios lachem le'elokim. And as an aside, this mitzvah of Zechirus Yitzias Mitzrayim, even though it's not really controversial, everyone agrees it's one of the mitzvahs d'oraisa to remember Mitzrayim. It's not listed in the Rambam's list of the Taryag mitzvahs, of the 613 mitzvahs. And there's a lot of question as to why. Rav Soloveitchik in his Yartzeit Shir quoted Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, who offered two possibilities. One is that since this mitzvah will not apply during the times of Mashiach uniquely, the Rambam doesn't count it, because the Rambam has a principle that we only count mitzvos that are eternal, that will be applicable during the times of Mashiach, which is most mitzvos, but there are some which will not. And the mitzvah of remembering Mitzrayim during the day and night is not going to apply during the times of Mashiach. And the second reason is that it's included in the mitzvah of Kriyas Shema, which is the mitzvah to accept God's kingship over us. And Reb Chaim is rather compelling in the sense that the Rambam in Hilchos Kriyas Shema, when he describes a mitzvah that to say Shema each day and night, and the fact that it's three parshios, Shema, V'hayam Shemo, and Vayomer, within that description of the parshios of Kriyas Shema is where he says that the reason why we say the third paragraph at night is because it reminds us of Zechirus Yitzias Mitzrayim, which is a mitzvah to remember Mitzrayim, lan tizkor yom tzescha me'eretz Mitzrayim kol yomei chayecha. But it's very interesting that so there's basis for Reb Chaim's assertion that remembering Mitzrayim is part of the mitzvah of Shema, but you have to think about why it is that remembering Mitzrayim is so fundamental to our belief itself, to Kabbalah's Ol Malchus Shamayim. But it relates to the fact that remembering Mitzrayim and our persecution is something which we do not only once a year, but also throughout the year. And I also noticed recently that Rabbi Przansky, in his blog, refers to this letter that someone wrote to him about the recent controversy in Israel about the conscription of yeshiva boys to the army. And I just thought it was interesting that people refer to it in the terms of religious persecution. And in pictures of rallies I saw in Israel, Hatzileni na miyad achi, save me from my brother, referring to that other Jews are persecuting me in the way that Esav persecuted Yaakov, and referring to it as a Gzeras Shmad, time of persecution. Where what's interesting and a little bit disturbing is that we use these terms of persecution for something which is controversial, but hard to describe as persecution, hard to identify the shmad of enlisting the Israeli army, or and identify that with Esav presumably chasing Yaakov, trying to kill him, as if this is a pursuit for killing. But these languages of persecution are so familiar to us. But it's a whole outlook that we sometimes have of being the persecuted one and identifying ourselves as the persecuted one. In Sefer Bamidbar, we have a mitzvah to tzroras hamijanim v'kisem osam, to attack the mijanim. Ki tzorim lahim lachem, because they're attacking you. B'nichleihem asher nichlu lachem al dvar poor v'al dvar kozbi bas nasim ejon, etc. And why is it that we are commanded to attack the Midyanim? So Rashi says, "Shehifkiru b'noseim l'znos kedei lahatos chem achar poor." That really, essentially, Rashi thinks, which is really based on the Psukim, that since the Midyanim tried to curse us and then they couldn't curse us, so that they tempted us and seduced us to sin in order for us to sin. So essentially, it's revenge. And the Meiri moves away from revenge and says that this is an example of self-defense, which is actually the source for the principle of killing in self-defense in the Gemara Sanhedrin. And Heichan Amra, where does the Torah say that you can kill someone who's trying to kill you? They are constantly attacking you. You should attack them always, because they are always trying to attack you. In other words, the Meiri, which prefers to interpret this mitzvah as self-defense rather than revenge, like Rashi seems to, but makes an assumption that the Midyanim are always trying to attack us. And even if there's no indication that they're obvious attack, they are. The Torah promises that they are, that we know that they always want to kill us, and therefore it's always self-defense. And this is a very victim defensive perspective. Now, I think to answer many of these questions, we should look at not only Matchil B'Genos, but also the Messiah V'Shevach, the conclusion of praise. And if you look at the end of the Aramid Ovid Avi, the part that we don't say at the Haggadah, in the Haggadah, we find something very important, and that is that it relates to the spiritual freedom and achievements that we achieved, because it describes the fact that now I am in the Beis HaMikdash, the place where we have the opportunity to relate to God, and we can rejoice with all that God gave us, not only celebrating the first fruits, but celebrating the fact that we have a relationship with God now in Eretz Yisrael, in the Beis HaMikdash, that we can celebrate and offer these korbanos. And that's really the shevach of the story. That's really that the Messiah Mishevach in the Aramid Ovid Avi potentially is the fact that the story of Mitzrayim culminated not only with freedom and no more slavery, but culminated with the fact that we came to the Har Sinai, we got the Torah, we have a set of values and beliefs, and we come to Eretz Yisrael and we have a Beis HaMikdash and a nation which is founded on our values, and we have an opportunity to have a very intimate relationship with God in the Beis HaMikdash, and that's really symbolized by the end of the Aramid Ovid Avi, that now I'm celebrating my first fruits in the Beis HaMikdash. Even within the Aramid Ovid Avi, it's interesting that we have different interpretations, where what is the phrase Aramid Ovid Avi, a lost Armenian, Rashi interprets this Aramid Ovid Avi as a reference to the fact that Lavan wanted to kill Yaakov, whereas Rashbam interprets it as the spiritual journey that my ancestor Avram, the father of Avram, was lost and didn't have a belief, and now has found him. And we find a very strong emphasis in the Haggadah on the fact that we thank God not only for taking us out of Mitzrayim, not only for killing the Bechorim and saving us and giving us booty and splitting the sea, but like in the Dayenu song, we continue to describe the Midbar and Har Sinai and Eretz Yisrael and Beis HaMikdash. And that's because the building of the Beis HaMikdash was really the culmination of the Exodus. The story does not end with leaving Mitzrayim, it ends with the Beis HaMikdash, because it's there that we finalize and actualize our true goal of our true goal of having the opportunity to have this relationship with God. And the Beis Hamikdash, therefore, is a recurrent theme in the Halach Manya, as we saw before. Now we're slaves, we look to be free, Lashana Haba B'nei Chorin, because the freedom of Mitzrayim is not actually existent right now because of the fact that we lack that which Mitzrayim led to, which was the relationship with God that we would enjoy in the Beis Hamikdash. And that's why we focus on the mourning of the egg and remembering the Beis Hamikdash in a sad state, because of the fact that the Beis Hamikdash is fundamental to the freedom of Mitzrayim. The Orchatz, many poskim say, is done only to remember that which was done in the times of Beis Hamikdash. We do the Korech and make an emphasis that we're remembering the Beis Hamikdash. And the bracha that culminates Magid, Kain Hashem Elokeinu v'Elokei Avoseinu Yagi'enu l'moadim u'l'regalim acherim. The end of Magid, a bracha of Ga'al Yisrael, thanking God for being our Redeemer, also includes this wordy tefillah that we should be brought to new holidays in the future, rejoicing in the service of God and Beis Hamikdash, and we can eat the karbanos. Why is this whole entire beautiful tefillah for redemption, for the future, included in the culminating bracha of the Magid? Because the story of Mitzrayim was not just leaving Mitzrayim, but it was coming to Beis Hamikdash, and it's fundamental to the retelling of the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim that we aspire to the rebuilding of Beis Hamikdash, which was the purpose of Yetzias Mitzrayim. And therefore we end with Lashana Haba B'Yerushalayim HaBniyah. We end with Nirtza, focusing on Yetzias Mitzrayim. And in that sense, it's not only that we have a mitzvah to remember Mitzrayim, but we also have a mitzvah to remember Ma'aman Har Sinai, the events of Har Sinai, and the Ramban includes the remembrance of Har Sinai as a mitzvah of the Taryag mitzvos. And although the Rambam disagrees, and it's interesting to know why, but the Ramban thinks it's fundamental that we remember this event of Ma'aman Har Sinai. And the Sefer HaChinuch elaborates on the reason for the mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer is that the entire essence of leaving Mitzrayim was to come to the Beis Hamikdash, come to Har Sinai and get the Torah. And therefore we count the days from Pesach itself until Shavuos, until the time of Ma'aman Har Sinai, because that was the culmination of Yetzias Mitzrayim. It was not enough that we just have freedom. And the Torah reminds us of this mitzvah. Teach your children and grandchildren the day of Har Sinai, because that is equally as important to the story of Mitzrayim. Why is it that the Rambam does not include the mitzvah of Zechiras Ma'aman Har Sinai in his Sefer Mitzvos is an important question. The Ramban thinks it's so fundamental, though the Rambam thinks it's not even included in the list of the Taryag Mitzvos. The Rambam does emphasize remembering Ma'aman Har Sinai in the Mishnah Torah, but not as its own mitzvah. But certainly, as a community, there's no mitzvah to proclaim our remembrance of Ma'aman Har Sinai each day. There's no night where we relive the moment of Har Sinai. On Shavuos, the Torah doesn't even mention the importance of remembering the event of Ma'aman Har Sinai. I'm not really sure why, but it is possible that we think of Ma'aman Har Sinai less as a historical event and more as everything we do is to remember Ma'aman Har Sinai. It's not the historical event that's important, but the Torah itself that we have and keep constantly today more than the event in history, whereas Mitzrayim is something which happened. It gave birth to the Jewish people. Historically, history is important. And therefore, Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim is important. But Ma'aman Har Sinai is less of a historical event and more of a reality for today, possibly. In any event, coming back to where we started from, I think that Rav and Shmuel, their machlokes, wasn't argued on its merits in the Gemara because it was self-evident to all that they're both true in the two sides of the same coin. That that there's no question that the Torah's emphasis on remembering this night is the events of leaving Mitzrayim. There's no question that we left Mitzrayim, and that's what we have to remember, and that's what's included in Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. But Rav thinks that we need to focus not only on the events of the night, but also the purpose, also the full picture of where it led to and what it was for, which was establishing a relationship with God. And therefore, Rav says it's mitchila odei avodas kochavim hayu avosenu, and it's not merely a historical remembrance of that of the theology of Terach, Avram's father. Rav says that mitchila odei avodas gilulim hayu avosenu means that our ancestors did not have a relationship with God aside from the avos, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. The Jewish people as a nation, and really humanity, but certainly the Jewish people as a nation, did not have a real relationship with God aside from the Avos. And what happened in Mitzrayim is that God revealed himself to the Jewish people and to the world and established the opportunity of having an intimate relationship together, which began by the Exodus, but continued even possibly more significantly with getting the Torah at Har Sinai, getting Eretz Yisrael, getting the Beis HaMikdash. That was the purpose, that was the fulfillment, that was why we left Mitzrayim, that's why it was important. So Shmuel and Rav aren't arguing really about what happened or what we have to remember, but Shmuel thinks that everyone agrees that they're both critical. But Shmuel thinks that the focus of this night is the slavery and the freedom, and we'll count the Omer and count the Matan Torah and Beis HaMikdash in the future. And Rav thinks that even tonight it's critical that we also describe the theological journey that we took as we left Mitzrayim, not only towards our freedom, but towards our belief in God and our relationship with Him. And the Aramid Ovid Avi is the perfect text, I believe, for this story because the Aramid Ovid Avi culminates with now I'm here in the Beis HaMikdash, like we saw, that we left Mitzrayim, we got our freedom, and now we can celebrate with you, God, in the Beis HaMikdash. And therefore, the Aramid Ovid Avi includes the Matzchel B'Genus and the Messiah B'Shevach of both Rav and Shmuel, because it concludes with our freedom and emphasizes our celebration with God in the Beis HaMikdash. And the reason why we possibly don't say the end, the last three psukim of the parsha, even though the Mishnah says to finish the whole parsha, we can't complete it because it would be a lie for us to say that now we are here in the Beis HaMikdash celebrating with God, because we are not. And therefore, we cannot say that, but it's deafening. It's almost a deafening silence of the absence of that conclusion, because that was the culmination of Yetzias Mitzrayim. And that is why we have so much of an emphasis on the Beis HaMikdash in the Seder. All the things that are Zeichel HaMikdash, the Korech and the Orchatz and the Dayenu, which focuses on culminates with Beis HaBechira, and the egg to the memory of the Beis HaMikdash, because that's the culmination of Yetzias Mitzrayim according to everybody, and that's what Rav emphasizes by framing the Matzchel B'Genus Messiah B'Shevach as a process not only of Avadim Hayinu, and now we're freed, but also Mitchila Ovdei Avodas Gilulim. Originally, the Jewish people didn't have a relationship, didn't have a connection with God as a nation, and that all changed through Yetzias Mitzrayim, which culminated with Beis HaMikdash. There's no question that both aspects are critical on this night. Understanding how the Jewish people emerged as a nation, understanding that the Jewish nation is often persecuted, and God redeems us ultimately, and we always have faith that He will, because His hand is always with us through the challenges of history. And it's appropriate to think about the Holocaust and the Crusades and to include texts from that time period in the Haggadah, because indeed, B'chol dor v'dor omdim aleinu l'chaloseinu, it's true, to deny the challenges of Jewish history is to deny the obvious truth. And to not recognize God's hand is to miss an incredibly important piece of what Mitzrayim stands for, of of truth, of how God reveals himself to us. But to stop there is also to miss part of the picture, and it's critical to not only think in terms of being persecuted and being alive, and the concept that the Jewish people survived for the purpose of Jewish continuity. We survive in order to survive. It's to miss part of the picture. We survive because of what we believe in, what we represent, what we want to learn from God, and what we want to share with the world of our belief in Him, our Torah, our values that we can exhibit most effectively through the Beis Hamikdash, but even without it, to live the values of the Torah and to remember not only Yitzias Mitzrayim, but also Ma'amad Har Sinai and all that it represents. It's interesting that when we conclude the Magid, we transition from the story to the Hallel. We quote the Mishnah, which says that after we tell the story, Lefikach, therefore, since we've experienced this in freedom, we are obligated to praise God and to say Hallel, and to offer songs of Hallel. And therefore, we begin the Hallel in the Magid, because the Magid story leads to Hallel. Re-experiencing the miracles demands that we therefore thank God and praise Him for that which He's done. What's interesting to think about is, first of all, when we say Matchil b'Gnus Messiah b'Shavach, that we conclude with praise, is it that we conclude with a positive aspect of the fact that we left Mitzrayim and that we now believe in God? Or is the Shavach really the Hallel itself, which is Lahalel L'Shabeach? And I wonder if really the Hallel is the Messiah b'Shavach of the Seder. And I also wonder whether Hallel is the culmination of the story of Mitzrayim, or is merely, since we describe the story, we have to thank God for what we mentioned and remembered. But it's the mitzvah is to tell the story, and the story implies that we say Hallel as well. Or possibly the Messiah B'Shavach, the whole purpose of telling the story is to conclude with a praise and appreciation for God, because really the whole purpose of it all is not only the survival, but is most importantly the belief in God and the relationship with Him. And this can be illustrated possibly in the Gemara, which tells a very interesting story. The Gemara tells, Lama okunas hashulchan, why do we move the table? They used to move the table, we move the Seder plate. Why do we do that? Amri dvei Rabbi Yana kedei sheyakiru tinokos v'yishalu. So the answer is that the kids should see that something unusual happened, and they'll ask questions at the Seder. Abaye have a Yosef kamei de Rabba chazad to come dali takim kamei. So Rav Abaye was at the Seder of Rabba. Abaye was obviously a young child at the time, and he saw they moved the table. Amar lahu, he said, "Adayin lo kachilna. Why are you taking the table away? Why are you clearing the table? We didn't even eat yet." Atum kuma akri taka. You're moving the table from us. Amar le Rabba patrasa milomar manashtana. Rabba says we are now exempt from saying the manashtana. Tosfos qualifies and says, well, that's not really enough to exempt us from the Manashtana. The assumption was that he also asked all the other questions of the themes of the Manashtana, and that's why we were exempted from Manashtana. On the next page, there's another story. Amalei Rav Nachman l'Dora Avdei, Avda demafik le'mari l'chevivus v'yosef le'kasba udahava my boy le'meimerle. Rav Nachman asks his servants, if you're a servant and your master frees you and gives you gold and silver gifts, what would you say? So the response was that you have to give praise. So he says we've exempted us from the Manashtana. Here the Gemara is even more difficult because he didn't ask a question that will lead to the Avodah Mayinu, but nevertheless Rav Nachman considered this to be a fulfillment of the Manashtana. And there are the Ranshberg on the side of the Gemara suggests that possibly this is a mistaken girsa, especially according to Tosfos. You have to ask the actual questions of the Manashtana. How could you be exempted from just saying that if a master frees a servant and gives him gifts, that you have to praise him? But I wonder if the pshat of the Gemara could be maintained to be saying that really the whole essence of the Seder is to appreciate that we have to be grateful to God for all that we have. In other words, the purpose of remembering the entire story and making the changes on the table so that we remember that it's a different night and remember the story that God saved us from slavery and therefore gave us a Torah and therefore we're appreciative to Him. If the real focus of the Seder is the Hallel isn't just a postscript, the Hallel is the purpose. If you can come to a state where you really appreciate God, you have accomplished the purpose of the Seder. And therefore this hypothetical, which highlights the importance of having an appreciation for God and realizing that He's responsible for our lives and our existence as a nation and individuals, is the purpose of the Seder. The Hallel is the purpose, and therefore, appreciating the Hallel, you can even skip part of the historical events of the Manashana or the Manashana. But coming back to where we started, as we saw before, the Seder is all about appreciating Jewish history, appreciating God's role in history, understanding that our suffering has recurred and God has always stood by us, and therefore we have a relationship with Him. But also, like the Sefer HaChinuch says, we count the days from Pesach to Shavuos because we recognize that the purpose of this all is the values and the beliefs that we have, and therefore we define ourselves not only by our suffering, but also by our beliefs and values, and we remember both on the night of Pesach.